All right, YouTube, it's time for an Ebola update on this outbreak of Ebola that's been going on in West Africa. The news just got more alarming. Now, one part of it may be a hoax, or it may be some sort of disinformation. It's not entirely clear. I'm seeing it on essentially local Italian news. And I'm not seeing it on any mainstream news. It seems to have been picked up by like InfoWars and Before It's News and sites like that, but it doesn't seem to have hit the mainstream media. Although it might, if it is verified, because of course the mainstream media tends to lag several days behind as they fact check. The possible hoax story is that Ebola has now potentially made its way to two cities in Italy, Pisa and Tuscany, essentially. The story goes on to say essentially, and this ties in with the verified bit of news here, which I'll mention in a moment, that because this is a different strain of Ebola and they were testing for the Zaire strain, that some people gave false negatives. They actually did have Ebola, but were declared free of Ebola, and they just sent them home and figured, well, they have the flu or something else, and they're just, exhibiting a bad flu, send them home, give them water and antibiotics, they'll be fine. And that these people then essentially went to Italy because Italy has a very large number of migrants from Africa, specifically North Africa, and also a lot of tourism in between Europe and Africa as well. What they're claiming is that at least 40 people with potentially Ebola, which may be false negatives, have gotten into Italy and are now quarantined in a hospital in Pisa, and 50 more at this other location in Tuscany. That can't be verified. I don't speak Italian, and Google Translate only goes so far to tell you what's going on, so I can't verify that. If it's true, that's a disaster scenario, potentially, because these people would have been spreading Ebola to others around them, potentially, for some days or weeks before they ended up there, especially on planes, which means all hell could break loose. The verified piece of information, and the reason why that former story may indeed be true, and there's a link in the description to this, is from Reuters. West African Ebola outbreak caused by new strain of disease. Apparently, this is a Zaire strain mutant. And it actually isn't the regular Zaire strain. It's similar in lethality. It's similar in the way it's communicated, but this could explain why for the first time it's cropped up in a new area and it's actually crossed borders. It seems to be more difficult to contain this time, which should give people pause. It's a new strain. It's genetically very close to the Zaire strain, but it's not the same thing. So it's mutated. That should worry people because the incubation period seems to be longer, or that seems to be the case. I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like this incubation period is longer. It seems like it's more transmittable from person to person than it has in the past. Perhaps this is the one they were studying, coincidentally not even realizing it wasn't Zaire strain, when they found out that it was capable of being essentially expelled in the lungs and going short distances through the air and being communicated through the air. That's possible too. If it has broken containment and hit Europe, it's already hit major urban centers for the first time. Ebola typically has hit mud hut villages in the middle of the Congo in the South Sudan and Kenya. There's little to no infrastructure. There's little to no trade. These are remote areas. Somebody eats bushmeat, gets Ebola. They handle the corpse or they handle the sick person. The family gets Ebola. The friends get Ebola. The World Health Organization, everyone goes in. They quarantine the area. Most of the people infected die, and then it runs its course because it doesn't communicate as easily from person to person as it does through bushmeat unless the people are handling one another's corpses unprotected. So it burns itself out after a few hundred or whatever people die. For the first time, it's hit urban areas, though. It's in Conakry, which is the capital of Guinea. It's a city of 2 million people. It's in several urban areas in Liberia. It may be in Bamako in Mali, although that hasn't, again, yet been confirmed. The health organizations here are no longer reporting the death toll. Their line is, well, we've got it under control, So we don't need to report the death toll. The deaths are slacking off, we're containing it, everything's fine, and we don't want to panic people anyway. If the death toll is going down, why would you then worry about people panicking by reporting it? I would think the time to not report the death toll, if you want to prevent the panic, is in the beginning when you don't have it contained. But now apparently they've got it contained, they're working on it, people are recovering, the few survivors that there are, and no more new cases are coming up, and suddenly they stop reporting the death toll. That seems strange. It seems very, very strange indeed. People in Italy and elsewhere in Europe right now are worried because there are apparently hundreds of thousands of migrants and immigrants lined up on the North African border right now, ready to cross into Europe on ships where they know they're not going to get sent back. Most of the European countries no longer have any real immigration policy. They will essentially accept anybody who comes by boat from the third world and accept them as asylum seekers. If they do send them back, it's a rarity. Because again, these countries are third world. They don't keep really criminal records. There's no way really to look it up. Some of these people are, diseased, they're rapists or whatever, and they just get into Europe. They get a get into Europe free card. And again, if you look at the news about Sweden right now, they're proposing a law that makes it illegal to actually criticize immigrants, to criticize immigration, to criticize any politician that supports immigration policies that allow people in these countries. It's not good. There are a few countries in Europe that have some common sense. The rest do not. What they should be doing is worrying about these diseases. Even if they don't care about how many immigrants come in the first place, at the very least they should be screening for these potentially pandemic diseases such as Ebola getting into their countries. I would think that's common sense. I assume that the people in Sweden that run the government that don't have a clue what they're doing, apparently. Even the more right-leaning parties in Sweden are further left than the average socialist here in the true Western world, in the rest of Europe even. They don't seem to understand what's going on. They don't have any idea about the economic situation that, as it refers to immigrants and so forth. And they seem to be so far and out in left field that they think that anyone criticizing the policy is just, some sort of Nazi. But at least for diseases, this is a terrible idea. And there are migrants coming by the thousands into Europe every single day, which are not being properly screened in many of these cases because they're literally coming off of boats. I would think screening people for diseases should not be considered some form of racism, as it probably is in Sweden and all of these other countries. But back to this idea, since Ebola has now apparently mutated from its most lethal strain, this isn't one of the lesser strains that kills 20-30% of the people that get it. This is the Zaire strain. It kills 90% of everyone who gets it. Some of those who survive probably die of secondary infection fairly quickly because it leaves their body riddled with organ failure and all of these other problems. Even if the disease runs its course, they're still sickened for potentially months or years, and it can apparently persist in the body for some time, specifically in the reproductive organs. This is a problem when you have it hitting West Africa. Now, West Africa is like Central Africa in terms of its economic development. It doesn't have a good medical system. It doesn't have a lot of sanitation. What it does have that places in the Congo and South Sudan don't have are paved roads and mass transit systems. The disease is moving more quickly now in areas that have a rather similar amount of medical capability to deal with such an outbreak. Imagine if it were to hit someplace in Europe where travel is extremely fast, where again, the medical system can be overwhelmed if enough cases crop up at the same time. If it is in Pisa, in Italy, if it does start to spread in Rome or Naples or one of these places, people will simply flee to the countryside because they'll be so terrified. Some of them will take the Ebola with them. They'll say, well, Rome's been infected. I'm going up to Venice. Oh, well, now Venice is infected. It wasn't me. I'm going over the border. I'm going to Austria or Switzerland or something. People will flee place to place, taking the disease with them potentially. It's probably what happened with the plague to some extent. People should be concerned that even if this is a hoax, which it doesn't sound like a hoax to me, because of this new strain developing, the story does at least sound feasible that this would give a false negative which could lead to such a story cropping up. Even if it is, there's always the possibility it will hit Europe in the future. Ebola will not always be just relegated to the African continent. At some point, it will jump continents, it will hit a major urban center, and it will potentially become a pandemic. It could be now, it could be next year, it could be with the next outbreak, or it could be 100 outbreaks down the road. At some point, it will. Just like nobody saw the Spanish flu coming. They said, oh, well, these people just have a bad flu. And then people started dropping like flies. And something like 50% of the people got it. And they're like, oh, this is a bad flu. But I'm sure it's just going to stay over there. And then it jumps borders and starts hitting the entire world. People are like, oh, well, I guess I should have prayed to Jesus more. Or something like that. I should have prayed to Buddha. People think their God's going to save them from, something that crops up naturally. I suppose the Christians are going to look at this and deny that this is actually some sort of evolutionary trait, that this suddenly, the genetics changed and it's a totally new strain and becomes more communicable with a longer incubation period. But that's not evolution. It's only microevolution, if they even admit it. It's sad, because if it does go pandemic mode, it will potentially kill 90% of the humans on Earth, unless it, again, mutates again, becomes just as communicable but less deadly, and begins inoculating people against the original version, which seems to be the case with the Spanish flu. So it is possible that it has now hit Italy. I would worry if I was in these locations until they're saying, the health organizations in Italy are saying it's a hoax. However, there are also conflicting reports that these hospitals are indeed on lockdown. And if I have any Italian savvy individuals here who are in those areas, if you could tell me, if you happen to see on the news or locally, if these hospitals in Pisa and Tuscany actually are locked down. Because if they are, people need to start worrying. Because that would indicate that these stories are true. But I do not read Italian. I do not live in Italy. I can't confirm one way or the other. I would have to wait till mainstream news reports it, which is always a hindrance. Of course, I can get all the news from my local area, which is the middle of nowhere, but I can't get it from Italy because I'm not over there. But at the very least, the fact that a new strain has apparently broken out in a new part of Africa alone is worrying. That's worrying enough. Just the mere fact that it has now mutated, showing that it has the capability to mutate in the future. What happens next? Even if this, specific strain dies out entirely, what happens if the Zaire strain mutates again and becomes completely airborne, much more durable? What if that one little mutation allows it to survive for hours outside of a host, floating around on the breeze, until you get essentially a miasmus around the entire world, where everyone just starts dropping like flies randomly across the entire globe? That would be one for the history books, if there was any human history